At 4:17 on a Thursday afternoon, Senate Majority Leader John Thune walked onto the Senate floor to execute what should have been a routine procedural formality. He prepared to ask for unanimous consent to adjourn the Senate's equivalent of turning off the lights and locking the doors before a recess. It is a request granted dozens of times a year without debate, delay, or objection. Not this time. Standing at his desk was Utah Senator Mike Lee. Seated around him were 11 Republican senators who had spent the previous 72 hours quietly coordinating with Lee's office. They were not scattered across Capitol Hill, huddled in hallways, or waiting in the cloakroom. They were physically in their chairs, watching the Majority Leader approach the podium with a request that required exactly 0 objections to pass. Thune read the request into the record. The presiding officer asked the routine question, "Is there objection?" Mike Lee rose. "I object." 2 words. In less than 3 seconds, the unanimous consent request collapsed. The motion to adjourn died with it. The Senate was frozen on Capitol Hill, unable to leave. And John Thune, who had spent 18 months managing the Save America Act through scheduling maneuvers, deferred votes, and carefully crafted procedural agreements, stood at the podium with 11 members of his own conference seated behind him on a floor he no longer controlled. Most of Washington never saw it coming. The scheduling notice for adjournment had been filed that morning. Leadership staff ran a routine headcount and found no confirmed objectors. The conservative bloc that threatened floor action back in August appeared contained by a Friday night agreement and a commitment to a September reconciliation process. For 48 hours, Lee's office maintained deliberate ambiguity. That ambiguity was the strategy. To understand why this blindsided leadership, you have to look at how the Senate actually functions. The institution operates almost entirely on unanimous consent. Its formal rulebook is so rigid that if every debate, timeline, amendment, procedure, and voting schedule were enforced literally, governing would grind to a halt. Unanimous consent compresses days of formal maneuvering into hours or minutes. Under Senate rules, it takes only 1 senator to kill a unanimous consent request. Just 1. When an isolated lawmaker objects, leadership treats it as an individual problem, offering side deals, applying pressure, or waiting them out. 11 senators changes the entire political battlefield. Lee did not assemble 11 lawmakers because he needed their numbers to block adjournment. His single objection was legally sufficient. They sat in those chairs to create a visible headcount on camera. They transformed an individual procedural protest into an organized conference rebellion, stripping Thune of the ability to dismiss the standoff as a rogue action. The composition of that bloc revealed an even deeper shift. This was not merely the predictable roster of conservative hardliners. It included 3 senators who had never before been publicly associated with floor action on the Save America Act. Alongside Lee stood Rick Scott of Florida, who had consistently pressed leadership since the August recess standoff. Ron Johnson of Wisconsin was in his seat as well, a pivotal development signaling that Johnson had set aside his ongoing dispute over spending offsets to join the floor action directly. The remaining members spanned 3 distinct categories: lawmakers from deep red states under intense base pressure to deliver the bill, incumbents facing competitive November races who calculated that fighting on the floor was safer than defending another leadership delay, and institutionalists persuaded by Lee that 6 consecutive floor failures justified an aggressive procedural response. From the moment Lee uttered those 2 words, the legislative battlefield completely transformed. The blocking action did not halt Senate business. It forced John Thune into 3 narrow paths, each carrying an immediate political price. Option 1 was the textbook procedural route: file a formal motion to adjourn and trigger a roll call vote. That formal process consumes roughly 30 hours. During that window, the Senate remains officially in session. Senators cannot leave Washington without risking a missed quorum call, while cameras broadcast an idle chamber stalled over a basic motion to go home. Worse for leadership, that vote would be permanently entered into the congressional record. Every Republican would be forced to cast a public vote on whether to leave Washington with the Save America Act unresolved. A vote to adjourn is documented proof of prioritizing recess over delivery. A vote to stay is a direct rebuke of leadership. Thune could not call that vote without exposing the exact depth of his conference's divide. Option 2 was direct negotiation behind closed doors, Thune's preferred method for framing forced concessions as leadership strategy. But Lee's terms left no room for face-saving half measures. He did not ask for a vague promise or another leadership press release. He demanded an exact calendar date, a specific time, and a committed reconciliation vote on the Save America Act before the September 30th government funding deadline, with 0 intervening agreements allowing leadership to run out the clock. Option 3 was a modified unanimous consent request, offering Lee a binding floor commitment in exchange for letting the chamber adjourn. This was the path of least institutional damage, and precisely what Thune's floor director was seen discussing with Lee's staff immediately after the objection. What gave Thursday's standoff its devastating force was the ticking clock of the September 30th government funding deadline. Congress must pass appropriations or a continuing resolution to avert a shutdown. That requires floor time, debate, and roll call votes. Every hour the Senate spends trapped in a procedural standoff over adjournment eats away at the calendar. A government shutdown caused by a Republican floor war over the Save America Act would be catastrophic for candidates heading into November. That leverage cut both ways. For Thune, an extended stalemate shifted the blame squarely onto a majority leader incapable of managing his own chamber. For Lee, the pressure window was narrow. Hold the bloc together and force a binding floor date, or watch the coalition fracture and surrender the calendar back to leadership control. Sustaining a floor blockade, however, requires extraordinary physical discipline. Unanimous consent objections can hold for hours, but stretching them across days tests the logistical limits of individual lawmakers, juggling flights, committee hearings, and campaign commitments. Thune's counter-strategy relied on private pressure, waiting for a single member of the 11 to leave town and miss the next unanimous consent call. Yet by 6:30 Thursday evening, the dynamic shifted from confrontation to backroom negotiation. Thune's floor director and Lee's chief of staff were seen exiting the Capitol together. The Senate did not adjourn Thursday night, and when leadership posted the official calendar for the Friday 10 a.m. session, it contained a brand new unanimous consent agreement that did not exist 24 hours earlier. The stakes of the next 72 hours reach far beyond a single procedural standoff. If Lee's coalition holds and forces a binding floor commitment by Friday morning, the Save America Act secures its first concrete, dated, publicly committed floor vote in the entire 18-month saga. Not a vague leadership assurance. Not a tentative scheduling notice that can be quietly scrubbed on 48 hours' notice. A binding vote extracted under the visible pressure of 11 senators occupying the Senate floor. If the bloc fractures before that commitment is secured, Thune gets his adjournment. The calendar snaps back to leadership control, and the bill's September pathway narrows to a razor-thin corridor. Resurrecting it before September 30th would require 3 separate hurdles to clear simultaneously: a credible threat of a government shutdown, an immediate breakthrough on Ron Johnson's spending offset dispute, and a clean ruling from the Senate Parliamentarian on the Byrd Rule regarding the bill's grant provisions. Each of those hurdles is volatile on its own. Clearing all 3 together is a procedural long shot. If the standoff extends through the weekend and into the following week, the calendar itself becomes the weapon. A Senate paralyzed by 11 members blocking unanimous consent as the fiscal year expires without a funding bill is a chamber on the brink of a shutdown narrative. That political fallout would consume every other legislative priority, including the Save America Act. Lee understood that risk from the beginning. Thursday's objection was never intended as an indefinite occupation. It was precision leverage designed to force a resolution within a 72-hour window. Look at how the entire power dynamic of this fight has inverted. For 18 months, every attempt to advance the Save America Act depended on John Thune's cooperation. Moving the legislation required his scheduling authority, his conference management, and his unanimous consent agreements. That dynamic delivered 6 floor failures and a deferred reconciliation process without a single vote reaching the floor. What unfolded at 4:17 on Thursday afternoon was the first maneuver in this entire saga that bypassed Thune's cooperation entirely. It required only his compliance. The blocking action did not ask leadership for a favor. It informed leadership that the United States Senate would not conduct another piece of routine business until a firm, committed floor date was put in writing. That is a fundamentally different demand structure and an entirely new leverage profile. 11 senators. 1 objection sustained in plain sight of the cameras. And a majority leader who walked to the podium expecting business as usual, only to find a chamber he no longer commanded. The procedural foundation is already built. Vice President Vance ruled from the chair. Lee raised the point of order. 11 senators occupied their desks and proved their readiness to hold the floor. The fight is no longer about parliamentary theory. It is a direct contest of political endurance, whether 72 hours of floor pressure and the impending September 30th funding deadline can extract the result that 18 months of conventional negotiation could not. When the Senate convenes at 10 o'clock Friday morning, the outcome will not hinge on an elaborate debate or a backroom speech. The language of the new unanimous consent request rests on Thune's calendar. And when the presiding officer looks out across the chamber and asks whether there is objection, the next 2 words spoken from Utah's desk will determine whether leadership yielded or whether the shutdown clock begins to run out.